Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 83, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I think I've finally been able to settle into my summer routine, and just when I get used to my summer routine, it'll be time to settle into my fall routine. So I just have to kind of go with it. I am not a person who likes hot weather. I tell people that I didn't move to Montana for the hot weather. I like winter. So I usually try to get out in the garden early. As soon as my husband leaves for work, which in the summer might be 6:30, 7 o'clock, I'll head out to the garden and I'll weed and I'll water and I'll do whatever else needs to be done out there. And then usually by 10:30 or 11, I'm done. And I come back in and have lunch and then go to my sewing room. I still don't get quite as much sewing done during the summer as I do during the winter, but I try to chip away at my projects. This past weekend, I was able to finish a big project that I've been working on for a couple of months, and it's going to be the subject of today's podcast because I want to talk about making mistakes. Making mistakes in your sewing and how to recover from them. And this project just happens to be a great example. If you're just joining me on the podcast for the first time or you haven't listened to all the back episodes yet, I am going to Bernina University in a couple of weeks. The store where I teach here in Kalispell is a Bernina dealer. And when I found out that Bernina University was going to be in Salt Lake City, I asked the owner if I could tag along with the group of employees that she sends if I paid my own way. I'm an independent contractor. I'm not an employee, and I didn't think it was fair to ask her to foot the bill for me. Plus, I have a fairly large travel budget anyway. I like to travel. So I asked her if she would let me be part of her employee group, and she said yes. So there are, I think, 6 of us going from the store. And Bernina University is where the dealers get to learn about new products, take classes on the machines and how to use them so that they can better serve their customers. And because I teach on a lot of these machines, I really wanted to go so that I could be a more effective teacher. And I'm taking 4 days of classes. I'm so excited. The classes run the gamut, everything from machine quilting and embroidery all the way to garment sewing. And as much as I love teaching, I like being a student too. So the 6 of us who are going to Bernina University decided that we would all make quilted jackets. They picked out the beachcomber jacket pattern from Laundry Basket Quilts, which is a quilted jacket pattern that's made on a base of an oversized sweatshirt. So the sweatshirt provides the batting as well as the pattern pieces onto which the quilt blocks are sewn. And the quilt blocks in the beachcomber jacket are sawtooth stars. And the instructions in the pattern have you make sawtooth stars in 12-inch blocks and 6-inch blocks. And you'll notice that 6 divides very nicely into 12, which makes sense, but you'll also find out that I didn't necessarily follow that pattern, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So we got the pattern, and the other girls decided that they were going to make their jackets using a specific quilt design or fabric designer's fabric line. So one woman is using Tula Pink, another one decided to do K Facet. I chose Tim Holtz. I have been collecting Tim Holtz fabric for well over a decade, way back when you could get Tim Holtz fabric at Joann Fabrics. And I have a fairly large stash. I use it for very special projects. And I'm currently adding to it with his palette collection. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. It's very cool. Each bundle of fabrics is a specific colorway. So thus far I have gotten the pink colorway, the green colorway, and I just ordered the teal colorway from Fat Quarter Shop. But I also have a lot of the abandoned line, and that was what I decided to use in my jacket. I also decided not to use the beachcomber pattern only because you all know my struggles with clothing that is too short because I'm a little bit taller than average, and I wanted a longer jacket. So I went looking for a jacket pattern, and I didn't have to look far because I've been collecting quilted jacket patterns because I bought some quilted fabric last fall at Hobby Lobby thinking that I would make a quilted jacket out of it, and I just haven't been able to get that project to happen. So it was kind of funny and a little bit ironic that we decided to do quilted jackets for Bernina University. But in any case, I settled on the McCall's 8560 quilted jacket pattern because it was long and it actually comes in two lengths, and I made the shorter length and it's plenty long on me. And because it had a V-neck, which I also liked. So I actually made up a muslin of that pattern using some pre-quilted fabric from Joann Fabrics. One of the other features that I really like about that pattern is it has a two-part sleeve with an elbow dart. And sometimes when you make a jacket pattern, it makes you look like the Michelin Man because the batting makes it stiff. So the sleeves tend to stand out from the body. The sleeves on this pattern are really well drafted, and I like them because of that elbow dart. So I got out my Tim Holtz fabric and I pulled two fabrics. I initially thought maybe I'd do everything from the abandoned line with a black background, but those prints are pretty busy and I thought I needed to simplify it quite a bit. So I settled on one print from the abandoned line with a print from the provisions line, which is sort of a solid background with, it's not grungy, but it's got some a distressed appearance to it. And it coordinated nicely with the print that I found because the background I chose was teal and the print has black and beige and a little bit of teal in it. So I was really happy with that combination, and I decided to make sawtooth stars in a whole bunch of different sizes. So I got out my set of Eleanor Burns flying geese rulers because her method is my favorite way of making flying geese, and I will try to put a link to a video or the instructions or something. You need the rulers to make the flying geese because she has you do something special with the squares that you sew together, but I find it's a really quick and easy way to make as many flying geese as I need to do the sawtooth stars, and they came together really quickly. I had a chart made up for myself because I was making sawtooth stars in so many different sizes. So I had flying geese that were finished widths of 1.5 inches, 2 inches, 3 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches. I had a whole variety, and I just made a bunch of different sized sawtooth stars. Unfortunately, that meant that they didn't all divide evenly into each other, and I sort of created a bit of a mess for myself. But the way I got around that was I made each of the sawtooth stars with a background border around it so that the stars look like they were floating on the background rather than being butted up against each other. So kind of a sashing, almost. So you can tell I've already gone way off script with this project. Not only am I not using the same pattern, I've decided to not use the same combination of sawtooth stars. I like to trace my patterns. I do that because I never know if I'm going to have to make adjustments or choose a different size. Even when I choose a pattern size based on the finished measurements and my body measurements, sometimes I need to make adjustments, and I would rather not have to do that on the original pattern pieces, so I trace them. So I had traced the pattern pieces for the McCall's 8560 jacket. And typically, when a pattern is cut on the fold, you only get half of the pattern piece. You get a line on the long edge that says place on the fold. And when I made my muslin, that's how I traced the pattern, so that I was cutting on the fold. But when it came time to do my Bernina University jacket, I wanted to have the entire back so that when I was laying out the quilt blocks, I could see specifically where they went. So I ended up tracing the entire back. And what I should have done was take that original half back piece and put it in a different room. I didn't want to throw it out because I might need it again in the future, but I should have put it someplace where I couldn't get to it. Because when it came time to lay out the quilt blocks, I did the back first, and that went really well. I was really excited with myself, and what I had decided to do was lay out the quilt blocks in a larger piece of fabric because I knew that quilting was going to shrink the fabric somewhat. So I made the quilt sandwich for the back a little bit bigger than the actual back pattern piece so that I could come back later, lay the back pattern piece over that quilt sandwich after it had been quilted, and cut out the back so that I knew exactly how big it needed to be. I made the Tamarack jacket from Grainline Studio a few months ago, and that pattern instructs you to cut out the pattern pieces and then quilt them. And I felt that there was too much shrinkage. I ended up with a jacket that was smaller than I expected. I really should have made a larger size. So I didn't want that to happen with my Bernina University jacket. I went with a silk batting for this jacket because I had a silk bat, a twin size silk bat, in my stash, and I also wanted something that was fairly drapey. In the Tamarack jacket, I just used a plain cotton poly batting, an 80-20 batting, and while it worked, it was a little thicker than I really wanted. I experimented for this jacket. The first thing I tried was using a layer of flannel between the two layers, but I didn't like how thin it was. It was almost too thin. So I went with the silk bat, and I really liked the way that quilted up. I used Fabulux from Wonderfill Thread, which is a trilobal polyester, and I did a variegated gold thread so that it kind of picked up the colors in the sawtooth stars. That's the first time I've quilted with Fabulux, and I absolutely adore it. So I'm sure that I will be quilting with that thread again in the future. It's got just a little bit of sheen to it, and I really like the way it looked in this jacket. So I had laid out all of my sawtooth stars with some sashing / background fabric in between them. I kept some of the individual flying geese and used those to fill in spaces where I didn't have room for sawtooth stars. I used some of the sawtooth stars as centers for other sawtooth stars for the bigger ones. So I was really happy with the way the back looked, and I thought, now I'm going to do the fronts. Well, instead of taking out the actual front pattern pieces for the jacket, I grabbed that half back pattern piece, thinking that it was the front of the jacket, and I laid out the sawtooth stars on both of those front pieces, and I layered them into a quilt sandwich, and I quilted them, and I took them back to my sewing room, and I laid them out on the cutting table, only to have the horrible realization that I hadn't made the fronts to the jacket. I had made two more backs, or actually two halves of the back. And the thing was that I had been working on those quote-unquote fronts for a couple of days, and it didn't dawn on me, of course, until I was completely finished quilting them, that those were the wrong pattern pieces. I had all those opportunities along the way to have that epiphany, and I didn't. I think that we all go through some kind of it's sort of akin to a grieving process when we realize that we've made a mistake with something, especially if we realize that it's going to be very difficult to go back and fix that. And I think that it behooves us to get through that grieving process as quickly as we can when it comes to sewing, because that lets us move forward with the project. So I spent about half an hour berating myself and calling myself names because I had done something utterly stupid and preventable. But then I decided that it was time to pull up my big girl panties and fix this problem. So I'm not telling you how long that process needs to take. I don't have much patience, so I just plowed through it. But honestly, if you need to put that project in timeout for 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, do what you need to do. I also had the motivation of being under a deadline and wanting to finish this so that I could get it off of my to-do list and move on to other projects. And I didn't want to be the only person on this Bernina University trip who didn't have a quilted jacket. So I got out the correct front pieces for the jacket and I laid them over the pieces that I had quilted for the front of the jacket. And because I had used half the back, there wasn't any overlap between those two pieces. The original front pattern pieces overlapped so that you could sew buttonholes for the jacket, but the ones that I had made were narrower, and so they weren't going to overlap. The shoulder shaping was also slightly different, but I looked at the pattern piece as it was laid over top of the quilted piece and did some measuring and realized that I could change the slope of the shoulder and keep the measurement the same. The only thing that I couldn't change was the shape of the armscye. The shape of the armscye on the original pattern pieces, on the correct pattern pieces, was a little more scooped than on the piece that I had quilted, but I didn't want to scoop too much of it out because I didn't know how the whole armscye was going to, what that length was going to be and whether the sleeve cap would still fit into it. So I didn't cut any of the armscye away. I decided to wait and see how the sleeve cap fit into the armscye, and if I needed to scoop some out, I would do it then. I also was able to change the round neck, which was what was on my pattern pieces that I had quilted, to the V-neck, which was on the original pattern piece. And it meant cutting off some of the quilt blocks that I had carefully placed so that I wouldn't be cutting off any quilt blocks when I cut out the pattern pieces, but there was no help for that. So all of that happened up to last Thursday. And on Friday, I took all of my pattern pieces and I finished the edges on the serger because I knew that I didn't want this to be a reversible jacket, and I had no intention of taking the extra time to bind the inside seams. So finishing them on the serger was my best option. I threaded my serger because this is how I am, and anything worth doing is worth doing in excess. So I threaded a teal colored thread in the upper looper to match the background fabric. I threaded a black thread in the lower looper to match the black or charcoal colored fabric that I was using for the lining, which was also from the Provisions line. And I used a black needle thread. So I did a 3-thread overlock wide using the left needle in my serger. And I made sure that when I serged the edges, the teal was facing up. The teal background of the pattern piece was facing up. So my threads match the color of the fabric in the jacket. And I chose that 3-thread overlock stitch because I didn't want the excess bulk in the seam. I knew those seams were going to be bulky anyway, and the 3-thread overlock stitch made them a little less bulky. I wasn't out of the woods yet. I still had to put the jacket together, and I still wasn't sure that everything was going to fit properly. So Saturday afternoon, after lunch, I went back to my sewing room, and I started to assemble the jacket. And I knew that the assembly wasn't going to take very long. It didn't. And I knew that because I had made a muslin of the jacket. I assembled the sleeves first so that I could measure the sleeve cap. And then I assembled the fronts and the back so that I could measure the arm side. And it looked like everything was going to fit. So I pinned it together and it did fit. I was able to ease the sleeve cap into the arm side, and I sewed that seam, and then I sewed the side seams, and I tried the jacket on, and it fit. So the last thing that I had to do was make binding and sew it around the opening. I decided to use the same teal for the binding that I had used in the background to make kind of a subtle binding for the jacket, and I'm really happy with that. It lets the quilt piecing shine. But once I got the binding on, I was left with the question of how to close the front of the jacket. Now, I could wear it just as it is without a closure, but I decided that I'd really like to have a closure. So I considered a couple of options. I thought perhaps I could use a frog closure on the front of the jacket, although the style of the jacket doesn't really lend itself well to a frog closure, but that was an option. I could use large hooks and eyes, which is one of the options given in the tamarack jacket pattern. But I'm not a big fan of those because they don't tend to stay closed real well. And as I was wearing the jacket around, I finally decided that what I want to use to close the front of the jacket is a zipper. So I went to the internet to see if I could find a supplier for a teal colored separating zipper, and Zipper Shipper on Etsy had what I needed, so I ordered that, and hopefully it will arrive before we leave for Bernina University, even if I have to sew the zipper in on the plane down. I'm hoping I can get this done before we leave. If not, I'll probably use the hooks and eyes until then. But I'll tell you, mostly I'm glad to have this project done. I needed to get it off of my cutting table so that I could work on a few other things, and I'm hoping to make a few tops to take with me to wear at Bernina University. And I also thought that because I had this bag of lemons in my hand and needed to make lemonade out of it, not only did I fix my jacket, but this gave me an opportunity to talk about mistakes on the podcast. So win-win for everybody. So now I want to talk a little bit about how to recover from sewing mistakes. And step 1 is to realize that they happen to everybody. You will never reach a point in your sewing journey where you stop making mistakes. And to expect that is unrealistic. You can get to the point in your sewing journey where you don't make as many mistakes, or maybe you don't make the same kind of mistakes, but you will still make mistakes. Accept and embrace that you are human, and that is part of the human experience. The second thing to know, and I alluded to this earlier, is that it's okay to be upset. It's okay to berate yourself. Don't beat yourself up and talk unkindly to yourself for weeks on end, but it's okay to say, boy, that was stupid, Janet. And just acknowledge that you made a mistake. Then do what you need to get past it. Whether that is putting the project in timeout, walking away and doing something else, working on a different project. Maybe for you, it's plowing through and coming up with a solution. I'm not sure what I would have done if I hadn't been under a deadline for this jacket. I might have rolled it up and stuffed it in a corner, who knows. Every project is different. Every sewist is different. So do what you need to. I would urge you, though, not to waste the fabric if you don't have to. If I had decided not to make the jacket, I probably would have turned it into a tote bag or something, just so that I could salvage all of my hard work up to that point. And if you decide to go ahead and find a solution, be creative. Think outside the box. This is the time when the sky is the limit. I find it's helpful to get a piece of paper and a pen and write down what my options are. So my options were, first of all, to remake the fronts of the jacket entirely. And I thought it was interesting that when I was telling my husband about what I had done, his first question was, do you have more fabric? Can you make 2 more fronts? And I said, yes, I have plenty of fabric. What I don't have plenty of right now is time. I could have done it. It might have meant some power sewing and staying up late, but I could have remade the fronts if I needed to. The other options that I considered were adding some width to the front pattern pieces, because, as I mentioned, the originals were wide enough that they could overlap, and my versions were butted up against each other. So I did look at them and I thought, well, I could probably do a quilt as you go type of thing and attach a little bit of width to the front of each piece, but in the end I decided that might be kind of clunky and I didn't want to do that. So that's when I started to think about what were my options for closing the front of the jacket. And my options for closing the front of the jacket were no closure, or the frog closure, or the large hook and eye, or a zipper. Let me also say here that having made a muslin in many ways saved my butt on this project, which is why making a muslin is in many ways a time-saving activity. I know you might think that I don't have time to make a muslin, it's a waste of fabric, but when you have to adjust something, having that original piece, I was able to put my original muslin on and look at it with a critical eye and say, what happens if I can't overlap these front pieces? What happens if the sleeve doesn't fit into the armscye? What are my options going to be then? It's easy for me to sit here and tell you what I think you should do. Obviously, my project worked out. This project, at least. I have had projects in the past that never saw the light of day. Some of them were mistakes in fabrication. I chose the wrong fabric. Some of them were mistakes in construction. Either I didn't follow the directions or I skipped a step that I shouldn't have skipped. Lots of them have been spatial perception mistakes because, as I've mentioned in the past, I don't have real good spatial perception abilities. I suspect that had my husband walked in and looked at that pattern, he would have said, why are you making the backs the front? And as I said, I looked at that pattern for 3 days while I was laying it out, and that never occurred to me. Some of the things that I have learned in my sewing journey are to slow down and read carefully. I have found that even reading the instructions out loud to myself makes a world of difference sometimes, because what I'm reading and thinking in my head may not match up with what the instructions actually say. And I ran into this, I'm going to tell a little story here. I ran into this some years ago as a knitting designer. I had a sweater pattern that was very popular and lots of people had knitted it. So I was fairly sure that we had caught any errors that might have crept in, my tech editor and me. But I got a phone call one day from a lady who was fairly irate, and she said, "There's a mistake in your pattern." And when people say that, I always like to say, well, would you get your pattern out and let's read it together so that I'm understanding where the mistake is that you're seeing. And she had been working on the cap shaping of a sleeve, a set-in sleeve, and she read the instructions back to me and she said, the instructions say to decrease 1 stitch at the beginning and end of every row. And she said, when I do that, I end up with too few stitches. And I said to her, let's read that sentence out loud again. So I read it to her, and it said, decrease 1 stitch at the beginning of every row. She had been reading it as decrease 1 stitch at the beginning and end of every row. And that's why she ended up with too few stitches. So when I pointed that out to her, there was this pause. And then she said, well, I still don't like this pattern. And she hung up on me. So I have found that reading out loud to myself and being slow and deliberate and not rushing into something keeps me from making a lot of mistakes. Another trick that I use is to practice unfamiliar techniques. Z.D. Donahue, who used to host the Sewing Out Loud podcast, used to say, there are those who test and those who wish they had. And I drill that into my serger students because that's particularly important on a serger, but it's also useful when you're sewing on a sewing machine. Before you start a project, get the thread, get the fabric, get some scraps. Practice the stitches. See if you need to increase the stitch length. See if you need to use a different thread. See if you need to use a different needle or a different presser foot. There are lots of places that could be adjusted to give you a really excellent result. Testing goes hand in hand sometimes with making a muslin because it lets you see before you start working on your good fabric what the outcome's going to be. And for sergers, what I find is that I don't always remember that I have my machine set up for a particular stitch. So I may have it set up for a 3-thread overlock and I really want a 4-thread stitch. So if I do a test with some scrap fabric first, I might realize, oh, hey, I have this set up for a 3-thread stitch and I really need to add the other needle and the other thread so that I have a 4-thread stitch. And remember that old adage, measure twice, cut once. I think that's also goes hand in hand with working slowly and deliberately and double checking your work. Recheck that math. Have somebody else check your math. My husband is used to me coming to him with a drawing and asking him to look at it and see if there's something that I'm missing because I know that that's not my strong area. For those of you who use rotary cutters a lot, I'm going to tell you something that seems very obvious, but I'm not good at this either. Don't leave your rotary cutter open on your table. Not only are you risking injury to yourself, that's a good way to accidentally cut some fabric that you don't want to cut. I also think, and this is a hard one because some of us have so little sewing time that we have to take it when we can get it. But I've made it a rule for myself that I don't sew after dinner because that is not my best time of day and I make stupid mistakes when I'm tired. So I very rarely pull all-nighters. I try not to be sewing things the night before I need to wear them. Again, I know that's not possible for everyone and we have to take our sewing time when we get it, whether that's when we're stressed or we're tired or whatever. But if you can avoid it, try not to sew or work on a project when you're really tired. We could probably talk about this subject for hours. We've all made mistakes. We've all been there. We've all had to recover from them. And even if you do everything you can to avoid them, a mistake is going to find you. I guarantee it. Feel free to share some stories about mistakes that you've encountered and how you managed to recover from them. I always welcome feedback. You can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. You can use the fan mail feature. You can leave a comment on the show notes page on the website, which is www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website is www.janetzabo.com, and that has links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website where I sell patterns and books, and also links to my blog. So if you want to see photos of my Bernina University jacket, It will probably show up on Instagram this week, but you can also go to the blog and check out photos there. That's where I post information and stories about things that are happening here in Montana. I will warn you that if you don't like snakes, don't look at the last couple of days worth of posts, because I happen to be quite fond of snakes and I have 3 or 4 in my garden, and so I've been taking lots of pictures of them. They are out there eating the bugs that would hurt my plants. We have some baby robins in a nest right outside our kitchen window, and I have pictures of them too. I'm going to be traveling for about a week, going to Bernina University and then going to Seattle to meet some friends of mine who are going to be there. And one of my friends is a sewist, and she and I are planning to hit up a couple of fabric stores in Seattle, including Pacific Fabrics. So I'm sure I'll have information about that when we get back from our trip, but there may be a week where I don't have a podcast because I'm traveling and haven't gotten one posted. So use that time either to listen to back episodes or to go do some sewing. And until our next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you do get to go sew something.